The book of Jonah is about the mission of God. We've been talking a lot about the mission of God lately, and we've been looking specifically at God's mission through the lens of the New Testament command to make disciples. The book of Jonah is going to show us that even though God's methods have changed from the New Testament to the Old Testament, that his mission has never changed. Unfortunately, today, some see a conflict between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Often these individuals see the Old Testament through the lens of law, of restriction or domination, versus a New Testament lens that they interpret through grace, mercy, and forgiveness. The problem with this line of thinking is it's just not compatible with what we read in the Scripture. Genesis chapter 6, where you should find law, Noah finds grace in the eyes of the Lord, not law. In John 13:34, where people would expect to find grace, Jesus proclaims that he is establishing a new law which will govern his people. You see, we're already finding grace where some expect to find law, and we're finding law where some expect to find grace. That's why that's a terrible lens through which to see the Scripture. Don't view the Old Testament as law and the New Testament as grace. Rather, you got to see how law and grace work together in both Testaments. The law of God was given to define sin, to work as a mirror, that when you looked into the law, it reflected back to you the condition of our hearts, which is a sinner. Grace, then, is God's response to those living under the law, that by demonstrating saving faith, he would exchange your spiritual account with Jesus' account. So, the Old Testament is actually a phenomenal place to study and learn about the heart and the mission of a law-giving, gracious God. Now, anytime you talk about the book of Jonah, there are questions about the veracity or the authenticity of the book. The book of Jonah is one of the most debated books, especially in the Old Testament, and that's because most people don't know much about the book. They know that God called this prophet Jonah to go to Nineveh, and he didn't want to go, so a big fish swallowed him. And if we're honest, that's normally where people get hung up. And you hear statements like this: "This can't be true. How's that even possible? No one could stay alive in a fish for 3 days. It's got to be a myth." Well, let me remind you of a couple things. Number one, this story is not about a magical fish. This is a story about a merciful God. And honestly, I wouldn't put Jonah being swallowed by the fish in the top 10 of the hardest things to believe in the Bible. I mean, just think about it. In the beginning, God spoke, and everything that we see exists. That's way harder than a fish swallowing a man. What about Luke chapter 2? "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you'll call his name Jesus." That's way more difficult to believe. Or what about Philippians chapter 2, where it says that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. And by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, God humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. See, those are way more difficult things to grapple with than a man being swallowed by a fish and living in a belly for 3 days. You see, the key question isn't, is it possible for a fish to swallow a man and him live there 3 days? That's not the key question. Any rational human knows the answer to that question, and it's no way. That's not normative. That's not how we see things normally go. But that's not the question. Here's the key question. The question is there a God, and does he work in the world? Because if there's a God, and he works in the world, then things like this become much more understandable and much more valid and much more believable, because it is not the normal operating world, but rather it is a God who has all power and all knowledge and all ability stepping into this world that he created, reversing and bending the laws that he governs the world with. There's a growing number of people today. Unfortunately, many of them stand in places like this where I'm standing, and they think that Jonah is a myth. They think that the book belongs in the Bible, but that it shouldn't be read as a historical account. Rather, it should be read as a parable, because everything in it is just too unbelievable for it to be accurate. To those people, I would say two things. One, the book isn't written as a parable. Look at verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. That's not how parabolic fictional stories begin. It doesn't say many, many years ago in a land far, far away. No, it says there was a real man with a real father named Jonah. The characters in parables, even when you think about Jesus' parables, his parables never had a proper name to them. It was a farmer went to sow seed, or it was a man built a tower, or it was a generic businessman went on a journey. The book of Jonah says, a word of the Lord came to a man, a real man, an authentic, genuine man by the name of Jonah. A second thing I would say is this. Jesus thought the story was true. In two of the Gospels, Jesus references this story as being true and being an illustration of his ministry on earth. So I feel like Jesus would be in a better position than anyone to know if the story's true or not. He thought it was history, so I'll stick with him. So have you found the book of Jonah yet? I hope so. I gave you a lot of filler. All right, I gave you plenty of time to find it. So let's dive into the book. No pun intended. I'll be reading from the ESV. Here we go. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, you notice how the book just starts with the Lord coming to Jonah, and it's kind of written as though you ought to already know who Jonah is. Well, technically, the careful Bible student will already know who Jonah is because of 2 Kings 14. I'm going to put these verses on the screen for you. 2 Kings 14, verse 23. It says, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. Now, pause for a minute. Let me give you a super quick overview of the history of Israel. Israel wanted a king, so God gave them a king, King Saul. King Saul was a terrible king. And he forfeited the right of having Israel's royal succession from his family, right? We all know this. And so God moved the kingdom from Saul's family to David. And David then became the next king. After David was David's son, Solomon, and Solomon ruled. But after Solomon, there was a civil war. There was a fight that went on between the 12 tribes. And this would be interesting to note. You know what they fought over? Taxes were too high. That's been going on a long time. As long as there's been taxes, there's been a fight over how much people ought to pay. So now the 12 tribes divided into two nations. You have 2 tribes that were the nation of Judah, and you have 10 tribes who are the nation of Israel. So now all of the Jews are in 2 separate nations, Judah and Israel. And over the books of Chronicles and Kings, you read about a line of kings, some for Judah and some for Israel, some good, most were very, very poor. With these various kings, when we read in verse 23, it says that Amaziah was the king of Judah, but that Jeroboam the second is the new king of Israel. That's all verse 23 was telling you, that Jeroboam has now become the new king of Israel. Look at verse 24. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. It's interesting. Judah had some good kings. All of Israel's were bad. And 24 tells us that Jeroboam the second followed in the line of Jeroboam the first, that he was an evil king in the sight of the Lord. Verse 25. What did he do? Well, Jeroboam, he restored the border of Israel. See, people have been fighting about borders for a long time too. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath and as far as the Sea of Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath Hepher. You see, Jeroboam II was a conquering and expanding king for Israel. And these military accomplishments actually fulfilled the word of the Lord through the prophet Jonah. You see, Jonah wasn't just a prophet to Nineveh. Jonah had a long-standing ministry to Israel before he ever went to Nineveh. You see, the people considered Jeroboam successful because he did all these military campaigns. But God considered him a failure. The people considered the nation to be strengthening during Jeroboam's reign, but God thought they were declining. Just a simple note, and I'll move on. Borders and economics are not God's measuring stick for a prosperous nation. You see, apparently, Jonah was all in on Jeroboam's campaigns. He was the one who had prophesied correctly about Jeroboam's victories. One preacher that I read after this week said this: Jonah was one of Israel's premier prophets. He had a very successful ministry during one of Israel's finest hours politically. He was like the Billy Graham of Israel. So, of course, the book opens with Jonah 1:1. The word of the Lord came to Billy Graham, to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, what did God say to him? Verse 2, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. So God's first words in this call to Jonah is, arise and go to Nineveh. I'm going to show you over the next few minutes, but this was an absolute gut punch to Jonah. It's interesting. This is the very first time that God sends one of his prophets to a group other than Israel. You won't find it anywhere before this where God sends his prophet physically from Israel to another nation. This is the very first time God does this. God has sent plenty of prophets to the nation of Israel. He sent plenty of prophets to the nation of Judah. Both of those are Abraham's descendants. But God is sending his prophet to Nineveh. Well, what's the big deal about Nineveh? Well, we read a couple things in our verse. The first thing is, it was a great city. That's not talking about its moral character. That's talking about its size. He's saying it was huge. It's a huge city. The second thing we learn is that it was an evil city. Nineveh was enormous. Jonah says later on in the book that it took him 3 days to walk from one end of Nineveh to the other. Nineveh was the capital of the great Assyrian Empire. So if you've ever heard of the Assyrians, their capital city was Nineveh. Historians tell us that the walls, think about this now, the walls to the city of Nineveh were so thick that they could ride chariots 3 wide on top of it. That's a huge wall. Nineveh had all the best food. It had the best entertainment. It had the best architecture. It was the buzzing hub of the largest empire of the world at the time. Nineveh was a great city. But, as is usually true with big cities, Nineveh was an evil city. People typically move from their smaller towns to the big cities because they offer more things that appeal to the cravings of men. I mean, you've seen that. If you drive the streets of Lexington or Louisville, you'll see plenty of businesses or forms of entertainment that you just don't find in Paintsville. Nineveh was evil on multiple levels, and I'll go ahead and warn you, this next part may be a little PG-13 because it was such a graphically violent city. And I need you to know this because it lays a foundation for the book. Nineveh bragged in their writings and in their history about how cruel they were to people that they conquered. It wasn't other people telling us what the Ninevites had done to them. No, this is found in the Assyrian Ninevite literature where they are bragging about the things I'm getting ready to tell you. You see, when they would conquer another city, they would take some of the living men and they would dismember them by cutting off both of their legs and cutting off their left arm only so that they could shake hands with their right hand while they were dying as a way to mock them in their final hours. When they would conquer a city, it was very common for them to skin alive the men, the women, and the children, and to spread their skins on the city wall as a flag of victory. They would take these individuals that had been skinned alive and they would bury them in the sand up to their necks. And then they would take a tong of sort and pull out their tongue and drive a stake through it all the way down into the sand and leave them to die in the anguish of the summer sun. If somehow they survived that, then they made them listen to Taylor Swift CDs over and over. I made that part up. But these people were unspeakably brutal. A staple of the city was a massive pyramid of human heads at every gate entering into the city of Nineveh as a constant reminder of what happens to those who dare challenge Assyria. So God comes to Jonah and says, Jonah, arise, go to Nineveh, and tell Nineveh just how wrong they are. Remember all the times you thought Jonah was a moron for disobeying God? Do you understand Jonah a little better now? Let's add another layer to this. You ready? Not only was Assyria, specifically Nineveh, brutal and violent, but read through your Old Testament. Who did they seem to target the most? Israel. Jonah's people had been the direct target of the hatred and the violence of Nineveh. In fact, it is entirely plausible that Jonah knew people by name who had been dismembered, impaled, or skinned alive by these Ninevites. And God says to him, "Go, preach." You feel Jonah's hesitancy now? You remember back a little over a year ago, October 7th, 2023, Hamas executed a surprise attack on the southern portion of Israel. And you remember that day, we all watched and discussed as Hamas not only did what they did, but they videoed it and they celebrated it because they were so proud of the unspeakable evil that they had done in victimizing men and women and children of Israel. You remember that day. Imagine this morning God spoke to a follower of his in Israel and said, "The evil of Hamas is before me. I want you to go and preach to them and tell them how wrong their behavior is." You see, that's precisely what God did to Jonah. So let's see his response. Verse 3, "But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." Now, although God's task for Jonah, we all recognize it was a difficult one, this is where Jonah's rebellion started. You see, Jonah doesn't just run to the other side of town. I want you to see this map. Now, you'll see at the bottom is a black circle. That's Joppa. And that arrow going up to the green city, that's Nineveh. That's where God called him to go. So where did Jonah head to? Tarshish. Modern day Spain. Jonah was fleeing for a city that was 1,500 miles away from Nineveh. Let me put that in perspective for you. If Jonah was in Paintsville and was trying to run 1,500 miles south, he would end up in Puerto Rico. If he was trying to run west, he would take up residence in Salt Lake City, Utah. That's how far Jonah planned on running from God. Remember, before God's call to go to Nineveh, Jonah was upright and righteous in every way. He was a faithful prophet to Israel. Remember, he was the Billy Graham of Israel. Here's where we find our first principle for the day. Principle number 1. Rebellion is simply saying no to God. Rebellion is simply saying no to God. You see, Jonah went in an instant from preacher to problem in the blink of an eye. With one answer, Jonah moved from righteous to rebel. You see, rebellion is simply saying no. God, I know what you want me to do. No. God, I know what you want me to say. No. God, I know what you want me to pray about, and I know how you want me to act toward others. No. Rebellion is simply that. We try to make it this big, sophisticated thing about how you were raised and how you were treated and what environment you grew up in. But when you really get to the brass tacks of it all, it's this. Rebellion is simply saying no to God. You see, we tend to evaluate our walk with God by comparing ourselves to others, right? I go to church more than most. I know the Bible more than most. I give more. I'm more moral. I sing in the choir. I go to Sunday school. I do all this stuff. You see, Jonah had a spiritual leg up on everybody around him, but still, it took one no for Jonah's life to spiral. You see, lordship involves all of you. God isn't interested in most of you or the majority of you. Jonah is proof of this. God wants all or nothing. So what is your Nineveh? What are the areas of your life that you consider off limits to God? If he agrees with you, then he'll get what he wants, but that's only a coincidence. It's not actually surrender. It's just God wanted what you wanted. But what is it that God wants, that God says, that God commands, that in your life is just Nineveh, and it's off the market? There's no way I will go. No. You see, maybe it's a relationship that you know isn't pleasing to God, but you won't let go of it. Maybe God doesn't have control of your debit card, and you'll give for special offerings like hurricane relief, but your streaming services and lifestyle and savings account is way too important for you to give consistently and sacrificially. Maybe your Nineveh is your time, your hobbies, your relaxation, or vacations, and they have a divine do not disturb sign hanging on the door in front of them. You see, we've got to learn this from Jonah because it's so vital to our life, and it's this: rebellion is simply saying no to God. And all of your life can be on track. And Jonah is proof positive that one no can send you into spiritual depths and despair that you didn't know existed. Look back at verse 3. Let's find us another principle. It says, "But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish." Second time this says this: away from the presence of the Lord. Ready for principle number 2? A ready ship isn't a sign from God. A ready ship isn't a sign from God. Jonah arrives at the dock at Joppa, and lo and behold, a ship is just waiting to go to Tarshish. Have you ever noticed that people assume that a waiting ship is God's approval or God's provision for their actions? Listen, I've had numerous conversations with people who were actively disobeying God, but thought they were convinced that God actually approved of what they were doing because it all worked out. I've known people in the midst of adultery who were convinced that because they were miserable in their first marriage and they happened to meet the perfect person, that God had sent that person to them to rescue them from a horrible marriage. Never mind, God said, "Thou shalt not." You see, if you allow your eyes to wander, there will almost always be a woman who will return your flirtations. If you're looking for a way out of your marriage, a too good to be true relationship will always present itself on Facebook. If you tolerate greed in your life, there will always be a great deal to something to buy, or a way to cheat, or a way to steal to get ahead. Listen to me. If you're on the run from God, there will always be a ship ready to take you to Tarshish. If you're actively disobeying God, you have an enemy who makes it his job to prepare a ship for you to Tarshish. Or how about this? Have you ever noticed how many people make decisions because they have a peace in their heart about it? People act like God hasn't written 66 books to tell you his thoughts and opinions. We have to wait for a peace in our heart. I want you to see something from Genesis chapter 3. You don't have to turn there, but I want you to think back. Eve is sitting there wrestling with whether she should eat the fruit or not. You remember what Satan came and said to her? It's okay. That forbidden tree is good for food. It'll make you wise. You won't really die. Think of how much better it'll be after you've eaten it. What is Satan doing? Satan is giving her a peace over what she's getting ready to do. Satan is literally communicating to her things that will numb her conscience, things that will give her a peace, an explanation for what she's getting ready to do. He's giving her an excuse. He's giving her a peace in her heart about what she's getting ready to do. Listen to me. The peace in your heart may be the enemy that is numbing you to disobedience toward God. Jonah is on a ship headed for Tarshish because the ship was ready and he took it. Look at verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. The story of Jonah is beautiful in the Hebrew. There's actually personification here where it says the ship thought that it was going to die, is literally the Hebrew rendering there. The ship threatened to break up. Principle number 3. God sends storms to break our self-reliance. God sends storms to break our self-reliance. That's what God does here with Jonah, right? Jonah self-reliantly runs away to Tarshish. So what does God do? God sends a storm to shake him, to break him. Pastor J.D. Greer said, one of two things will humble us. Your theology will humble you, or your afflictions will humble you. Our theology should humble us, but we usually are too hard-headed for that. Jonah knew enough theology to know that he should have been humble, but it took an affliction to break Jonah. You see, we're slaves to things. We're slaves to money, so God sends a storm and he attacks it. We're addicted to people's approval, and so God sends a storm and he frustrates us in our relationships. We're proud, and so God sends a storm wherein he lets us fall and fail. Now hear me, not every affliction is sent by God. Sometimes we suffer when we have done nothing to deserve it. But you can probably think of a specific time in your life when a calamity, when a problem came up that directly resulted from your disobedience to God. How do you know the difference? How do you know when a storm is God's shaking you or when a storm is just a natural occurrence? Well, you remember we just sang it. God's a good father, right? I'm nowhere near as good a father as God. But if I have to correct one of my kids, I tell them what they did wrong. I communicate what I'm trying to correct them in. Think about it. I don't just walk into the living room, yank them up, spank them, and say, now spend the rest of the day trying to figure out what that was for. Right? That'd be mean. Listen, if God is sending a storm to break you of your self-reliance, ask Him. Fall on your knees and ask Him and say, God, is this something that you're trying to break from me? Is this something you're trying to teach me? Because I promise you, as a good father who is sending a storm for your good, He's just waiting for you to break and for Him to be able to communicate what it is that He's trying to break you from. There's one final principle that we'll see, and it's at the beginning of verse 5. Look at verse 5. Then the mariners were afraid. Men who live on a ship are hard to scare. And these guys were terrified. Here's principle number 4. Our disobedience affects others. Our disobedience affects others. You never sin in private. Never. You never sin in private. You may do the action in private, but the ripples and the repercussions of that sin done in private will always leak out to those around you. Listen to me. For some of you, your family and your friends are suffering because of your disobedience. Your disobedience to God has made you a bad parent or an unfaithful friend or a disappointing spouse. You see, Jonah is the one who disobeyed God. Jonah is the prophet on the run. Jonah is the one who's not where he's supposed to be. And yet the guys on the boat are afraid because they are caught up in the wake of Jonah's storm. See, sometimes by taking care of ourselves, we are actually taking care of those around us. When Bryson was just a baby, Amanda and I became the people that we had formerly hated. And we flew on an airplane with a baby. If you've ever been on a plane with a baby on the plane, then you too have experienced purgatory, because it is awful. Yet, here Amanda and I go, boarding this plane with a new baby. I've flown hundreds of times before that. But because we had a baby, the stewardess singled us out. If you've ever flown with a baby, then you know the speech that I'm getting ready to talk about. Pre-flight, the crew comes around, makes their announcements, their final checks, all that kind of stuff. And the stewardess walks up to us and told us something that is actually counterintuitive. Or it should be counterintuitive. She said, while we're flying, if the cabin loses pressure, which means there's no oxygen to breathe, 4 masks are going to drop from the ceiling. And she said, make sure you put yours on first and then put a mask on the baby. Now, that's pretty counterintuitive, because everything that we're taught as parents is take care of the child, take care of the child, take care of them first. But think about it. If there is a loss of oxygen, and while you're trying to fight that baby to put a mask on its face, you pass out from a lack of oxygen, now what's going to happen to both of you? You're both gone. So the correct thing was for the mom and the dad to put their mask on first, so then they were ready and capable and able and in a healthy enough spot to take care of the baby. Listen to me. Some of you are so disobedient to God, and you may be living a life in private that is so counter what He wants, and the ripples, you see them every week, and you see them every day in your home and in your life and in your family. And what you've got to do is put the mask on yourself and take care of your spiritual condition, and then focus on your children, your grandchildren, your family, your friends. See, some of us don't realize, but our kids and our grandkids and our family and our friends and maybe even our church can be caught up in your storm. It's what happened to these mariners, right? They were professionals. They literally got on a boat just to go to work that day. But a prophet on the run, a prophet who said no, a prophet who had become a problem, got on that boat with them that day. And his problem became their problem. See, the book of Jonah has a lot over the next few weeks that it's going to say to us. But it all stems from these issues that we're going to continually see every week of how Jonah, the preacher, the prophet, the man, how Jonah in one decision wrecks his own spiritual life and continues to put others in danger. You see, the idea of rebellion against God is a dangerous subject. It's a dangerous thing to run from a holy God. We'll talk about this a little more next week. Think about this. Jonah next week is going to say to us and say to the mariners, "Oh, I serve the one God, the God of heaven, the God of land, and the God of sea. He's God over everything." And you can almost hear the mariners going, "Then you idiot, why are you running from Him? If there's nowhere that you can run from Him, why would you try?" See, that's why it said twice that Jonah ran from the presence of the Lord. See, Jonah's theology was too good. Jonah knew God was in Tarshish. Jonah knew that God was in Joppa. Jonah knew that God was in Nineveh. Jonah knew that God was on the boat. Jonah knew that God was in the sea. Jonah knew that God was everywhere. Jonah wasn't running from God because he knew he couldn't. Jonah was running from the presence of God. Now, literally in the Hebrew, that means from the face of God. Who did God show His face to? Those that He had a relationship with. You see, showing your face is a sign of relationship in the Jewish mind. And literally, Jonah isn't running from God. He knows that's impossible. Jonah is running from the relationship, from the presence, from the face of God, because his Nineveh was more valuable to him than the relationship and the presence and the face of God. Today, all of us must understand that we have a Nineveh. There are sections and areas and parts and thoughts and ideas and beliefs in our minds that we just say, God, that's off limits. I know what you want, and I know what you said, and I know what you expect, but God, I'm just not going to go. I'm just not going to do that. And that's when we become Jonah. And we start looking for ready ships to ease our conscience, to say that God has approved and He hasn't. And we're running from His face, and He sends a storm to break that self-reliance. And then now we find ourselves on a deck, panicked, with other people caught up in the wake, all because we said no. The story of Jonah is a powerful one, because it's not just about God's mission to Nineveh. It's also about God's mission to Jonah. And if we're being honest, some of us would say that our spiritual life is where it is because God's never told us to deal with our Nineveh. We've never been brought face to face with our Nineveh, but we know there's those areas that we put a do not disturb sign on. The book of Jonah is here as a mirror to show us what happens when everything's going well, everything's going fine, everything's going good. And God says, here's my command, here's my mission, here's what I want you to go do. And the danger that comes with saying no.